The wind had a bite to it that evening. Daniel Harris pulled his worn-out Marine Corps jacket tighter around himself as he climbed the stairs to his small one-bedroom apartment on the second floor. His boots scuffed against the old wooden steps, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had just finished another long shift working construction, his muscles aching from hauling steel beams under the scorching sun. But he didn't complain. Daniel had been through worse. The heat of combat, the relentless push of exhaustion, the sounds of war that still echoed in his head at night. Coming home to a quiet apartment was supposed to be his peace. Instead, his stomach dropped the moment he saw the paper taped to his door. A bright red eviction notice fluttered in the wind, the words slashed across the page in bold, heartless ink. Notice of eviction. Tenant, Daniel Harris. You have 48 hours to vacate the premises. Failure to do so will result in legal action. Daniel's fingers tightened around the edge of the notice. No warning, no phone call, no damn reason. His jaw clenched as he turned the key in the lock and pushed open the door. The apartment was exactly as he had left it that morning. The small couch, the stack of unpaid bills, the American flag folded neatly on his shelf beside his Purple Heart. Nothing fancy, but it was his. And now some greedy landlord wanted to take it away. Daniel didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone, his calloused fingers punching in the number of his landlord, Mr. Carter, a wealthy real estate investor who barely ever showed his face. The phone rang twice before Carter picked up. "Ah, Harris," Carter said, his voice slick with amusement. "I figured you'd be calling." "Yeah," Daniel growled. "Mind telling me why the hell there's an eviction notice on my door?" Carter sighed dramatically, as if he was explaining something to a child. "Listen, Harris, it's nothing personal. I've got new tenants lined up who are willing to pay double what you're paying. It's just business." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "I've never missed a payment," he said, his voice dangerously even. "I know," Carter said, and Daniel could almost hear his smirk through the phone. "But let's be honest, guys like you don't bring in much value. You're not exactly what I'd call long-term tenants." Daniel felt a slow burn crawl up his spine. "Guys like me?" he repeated. "Yeah," Carter continued, unbothered. "Ex-military, always in between jobs, never really settled. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate your service and all, but this is a business, and I need reliable renters." Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, forcing himself to breathe. He had spent years overseas, fighting in places most people couldn't even find on a map. And now he was being tossed aside like trash. "Carter," he said, his voice steel, "you can't just—" "Oh, but I can," Carter interrupted, almost laughing. "You've got 48 hours, Harris. I suggest you use them wisely." The line went dead. Daniel stood frozen in his small living room, the quiet pressing down on him. 48 hours, and nowhere to go. He had no family nearby and little in savings. The jobs he worked barely covered rent, let alone a sudden move. For a moment, he considered calling one of his old Marine buddies. But no, he wouldn't do that. He wouldn't ask for help. He had survived wars, loss, and hell itself. This question? He'd figure it out. Daniel grabbed a duffel bag and started packing, his mind racing for solutions. But deep down, he knew. This wasn't just about losing an apartment. This was about men like Carter thinking they could push around anyone they wanted. And Daniel wasn't the kind of man to go down without a fight. Daniel Harris had seen his fair share of injustice. He'd spent years fighting wars overseas, only to come home and find a different kind of war waiting for him here. The war of corrupt landlords and greedy businessmen who thought people like him were disposable. Not today, not this time. Daniel zipped up his duffel bag, his mind racing for a solution. But before he could even start looking for a place to crash, his phone buzzed. A text from his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez. "Hijo, I saw the eviction notice. This isn't right. We won't let this happen." Daniel stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. He barely had time to process before another message came in. Then another, then another. Within minutes, his phone was flooded. Neighbors, former colleagues, even strangers were reaching out. And outside, a small crowd had started to gather. Daniel walked onto his balcony and froze. Dozens of people were standing in front of his apartment building, talking amongst themselves, holding up their phones, filming the moment. Some were holding signs, and more were arriving. That's when it hit him. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It started with one post. A neighbor, Jake, had taken a picture of the eviction notice and uploaded it with the caption, "Landlord kicks out war hero with no warning. This isn't right. Who's with me?" Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The comments poured in, "A veteran? Seriously? This guy fought for our country, and they treat him like this. Where does this landlord live? I just want to talk." "Not in my town. We stand with Daniel." Then came the big names. A local journalist picked up the story. Then a veteran support group. And then the mayor's office. By the next morning, Daniel's story was all over the news. By sunrise, hundreds of people had gathered outside the building. Veterans, local business owners, neighbors, even complete strangers. They held signs, they chanted, they made it clear that this wasn't going to blow over quietly. A news van pulled up, cameras rolling. Daniel had always been a quiet man, never one for the spotlight. But today he stepped forward. The reporter held a microphone out. "Daniel, how do you feel about all of this support?" Daniel exhaled, scanning the faces of the people who showed up for him. He nodded. "I feel like I'm not alone." The crowd erupted into cheers, but as the cameras rolled, as the protests grew louder, one man watched from the shadows. Mr. Carter. Carter hadn't expected this. He thought Daniel would leave quietly. Instead, the entire town had turned against him. His phone rang nonstop, tenants calling to demand answers. Some even threatened to move out. And the worst part? The news crews were digging into his past. Other tenants started coming forward. Stories of sudden evictions, shady lease agreements, illegal rent hikes. Carter's little empire was crumbling before his eyes. And then his phone rang again. "Carter!" The voice on the other end was cold, his lawyer. "You need to fix this now, or you're going to have a very big problem." That afternoon, Carter finally cracked. He pushed through the crowd of protesters, his face red with frustration. "All right, enough!" he shouted. "This is getting ridiculous!" The crowd booed. Carter turned to Daniel, gritting his teeth. "You want to stay? Fine," he snapped. "The eviction is canceled." Silence. Then, the crowd erupted in cheers. Daniel stood unmoved, his arms crossed. "No, Carter," he said. "I don't need your charity. I want something better." Carter frowned. "Better?" Daniel turned to the crowd. "Who owns rental properties around here?" Several hands shot up. A local businessman, a former Marine himself, stepped forward. "I do," he said, "and I've got an open apartment rent-free for the next year." The crowd cheered even louder. Daniel smiled. "That's better." By the end of the week, Carter's name was ruined. Tenants moved out. Lawsuits piled up. And within a month, his properties were being sold off to new owners. As for Daniel, he moved into his new place, but he wasn't alone, because the entire community had his back. And Carter, he learned the hard way. You don't mess with a veteran, because when one of them falls, an army rises.